Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our COVID-19 webinar series. I am Kristen Eulenbrock, your host for this and the director of the Institute for Science and Policy, together with my colleagues at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science and our partners at the Colorado School of Public Health. We're thrilled that you are joining us for today. Today is episode 29 in this series for those of us who've joined for many, many episodes. This is the third part in our Road to New Normal series. The previous two episodes, we focused on the future of public health and science, as well as the future of education. Today, we're focusing on the future of our workforce, our businesses, and our cultural institutions, as well as the hopes for the road ahead for all of them. It has been a rocky year, to say the least, and the impacts have been felt disproportionately. I also want to extend my deepest sympathies to all of our friends and our families and our neighbors who have been impacted both by this pandemic as well as the tragic events of the past few weeks. Healing and building back will take time, but I am personally holding on to a little bit of optimism and hope. For example, I think many of us are aware that come Friday, vaccine eligibility here in the state of Colorado will be made available to everyone 16 and older. So of course, we still do need to remain patient and vigilant as we reach that herd immunity level and threshold, but there is hope. There's also really positive signs in our latest economic forecast for those of you who are following that, and we're going to discuss some of that today. So I'm really hopeful that our recovery is bouncing back quick from this global pandemic and that we're going to be much more resilient and better as we build back our economy. It is my great pleasure to have the lineup of guests that I have joining us today. I want to introduce two of our guests that will be joining us for the latter half of the program first before bringing in my first guest. Today we have Deborah Jordy. She is the Executive Director of the Scientific and Cultural Facilities District, also known as SCFD for those of us in that world. SCFD helps fund nearly 300 organizations across 7 counties. She has played a prominent role in the arts and cultural scene for the past 30 years in Colorado and joined SCFD in 2016. Good morning, Deborah. How are you today?
Fine, thank you. It's great to be with you all today.
Great, thank you. Also joining us a little bit later this morning is Ed Sealover. Ed is an award-winning reporter, and by award-winning, I mean he has 133 awards for his reporting, which is astounding. And he works currently at the Denver Business Journal, which he has since March of 2009. And I just realized that was the heart of our last recession. He covers state government, transportation, economic development, hospitality, tourism, and the beverage industry. Good morning, Ed. How are you today?
Good morning. Thanks for having me on today, and thanks for giving me an excuse to be back in my office for the first time in 4 months.
That's nice. Some of us are still at home, but that's nice. All righty. And of course, many of you probably know this if you saw our announcement. It is my great pleasure that we will have Mayor Hancock joining us this morning. The mayor has been with our city of Denver here since 2011, where he was first elected as mayor. He is Denver's 45th mayor and currently serving his 3rd term. He doesn't need much more introduction to that. We are very grateful that he's spending some time with us this morning. Good morning, Mayor Hancock. How are you?
Kristen, I'm doing well, and thank you for having me here. I'm really excited to spend some time with you this morning. And to my friends, Deborah and Ed, good morning to both of you as well. We're going to have some opportunity for question and answer as well, Kristen. I just want to share a few words with you to start off with you and the audience. I just want to first say, when I first started college and I took a course called Politics of the 60s, the professor started the very first class in this manner. He said, you can sum up the 60s in these terms: assassination, 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 assassination. Kennedy, Kennedy, Malcolm X, King. War, resignation, and then rebuild. We have just faced the most unprecedented year. And so I started thinking about 2020 until March of 2021. And we can begin to sum it up simply in this manner: pandemic, shutdown, mask, demonstration protests, presidential tumult, insurrections, recounts, of course, and Boulder, all in a matter of 12 months. To say it was 2020 and the first part of 2021 was unprecedented is to really, I think, understate what we as a society, as Americans, have just gone through. Today in Denver, we wake up with 529 less souls than we did at the beginning of 2020. 63,000 people in this city alone infected with the COVID virus. 128 million people worldwide. The reality is simply, we have been changed, not just by COVID, but the reckoning on social justice that we saw happening around the world as many of us witnessed that terrible video of the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis last May. In 2020, as mayor, I saw the toughest decisions, or I was faced with the toughest decisions I've ever had to make. It was questions of how do we balance saving lives and livelihoods? And at some points, I had to make decisions that it's about lives. We can rebuild livelihoods, knowing that the decisions would devastate people and hurt families and disrupt and destabilize families all over the city. Today, though, we have a light at the end of the tunnel. We begin the process of moving from rescue to recovery. We're still in the phase of trying to get needles into as many arms as we possibly can in the city of Denver, building the infrastructure so folks can access this very important vaccine so we can begin the process of recovering, not only economically, but socially, culturally, and psychologically. And so the goal today is to continue to try to get people vaccinated, and hopefully tomorrow, in just a few weeks, when I mean tomorrow, I mean a few more weeks, we'll be able to say we can turn the switch to recovery, putting people back to work, helping people to begin to stabilize their lives, bringing people back to the centers of our city where vibrancy once reigned, as this was one of the most vibrant economies in the country. And I'll close simply by saying this: cultural and arts institutions and organizations will lead the way. People are so excited and have such pent up plans or energy to get back out, see live music, live performances, to walk through some galleries, just to touch, to laugh, and to enjoy the leisure lives that we in Denver and throughout Colorado enjoy so much. So I'm excited to be here today because I know that Denver Museum of Nature and Science plays such a critical role in that. And all of you as patrons of all of our cultural and arts facilities, you play a role in driving our economy, but also you'll be the leading blockers downfield as we try to rebuild this economy brick by brick and begin to stabilize folks in our city. So again, Kristen, thank you for having me. I look forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Mayor, for that really nice, hopeful message. I'm seeing already comments in the chat that people really appreciate your leadership and joining us this morning. I want to pick up on something you said, which comes down to really tough decisions that you've had to make, as well as a lot of our political leadership across the state. And the idea is that there were trade-offs that had to be made between, as you said, people's lives and livelihoods, and tough decisions. And people have been criticized, particularly our government leaders, for decisions that they had to make. So I want you, if you can just provide, since I have you, and you've had to make these tough decisions, what are some of those trade-offs between proactive versus reactive policies that you had to make where you think we did a good job and maybe where we didn't do such a good job?
Great question, Kristen. I'll remind everyone, Denver was the first city in the state, one of the first cities in the state, I should say, that ordered a stay-at-home mandate and of course, mask mandates. Those were proactive. And the reality is we knew this virus was here. We were fighting something we couldn't see, smell, or touch. And that's scary. But we also didn't realize how long and how extensive the impact of this virus would be. We knew people were dying. We knew people were being infected and people were dying. And we wanted to stem that as much as possible. And so I'll never forget the day that I sat with the staff and our public health directors, and we made the decision to shut the city down. That was in March, mid-March of last year. Interestingly enough, just 5 minutes earlier, we had devised a strategy to encourage people to be careful, social distance, wash your hands, but continue to patronize our restaurants. That's what we were going to push a campaign out to do that. But as the staff walked out and we started getting more and more alerts, literally in 5 minutes, about the spread of the virus and about deaths occurring, everyone walked back in my office and said, Mayor, we need to do something different. And they the public health director began to advise me on what he's seeing in terms of spread, and strongly recommend that we take more decisive action. It was at that moment that I decided to shut the city down. We had been in conversations with the governor. We knew it was one of the options. We knew it would be a tough call, but also the right call to save lives. And I believe that early decision, along with our mask mandate, saved lives in our city.
Thank you. I'm going to be asking my other guests this later too, but I want to ask you, in a time of the pandemic, we also have seen transformation happening, new ways of doing things. From your perspective, where are some of those transformational changes that have taken place because of this pandemic that we're in that you think are here to last?
Well, I think one, people, you're going to see businesses and certainly the city government, we are in the process of evaluating it, are going to have a new culture in where people report to work, or if they report physically to work. I didn't know about Zoom before the pandemic. I mean, how many of you all heard about Zoom or the Teams before pandemic? I knew none of this stuff, but we found that we can actually communicate, get business done, and be productive through Zoom, this virtual reality that we have. So I think you're going to see companies institute maybe rotational remote working culture. I think it's still important for folks to be in person when appropriate. I think those incidental coalitions, the ability to cross-collaborate on issues and opportunities, the culture of getting to know your co-workers and building that esprit de corps, still extremely important. But I do believe you're going to find people not in such demand for space as they reduce the footprint of their companies and fewer people reporting at one time to work. And I think that's going to make a difference. You're going to find what we call condominium cubicles, where people, 2, maybe 3 employees are sharing a cubicle based on that rotational strategy. We're going to do it in the city of Denver. We're looking at it now, and I think it's going to make a difference. We saw, Kristen, our employees be more productive through this experience than less productive, and that was a phenomenal finding.
Yeah, and I think many of us can experience that more productivity too, through the lens of the non-ending Zoom meetings or whatever, because you can get so much more done when you're not moving around office to office. And at the same time, I will admit, is absolutely and utterly exhausting at times, and people's mental health is really at times being strained.
Yeah.
So Mayor, we just have a couple more minutes with you. One question that we love to ask, we've been asking throughout this entire series through various different lenses, is the idea of trust in government, trust in our institutions, trust in science. We think really deeply about the issue of who has trust, how do we maintain trust, and how do we rebuild trust when it has been lost. From your own perspective and the office that you sit in at the mayor, and your perspective, how does trust factor into the certain decisions that you've had to make, and where is your outlook on how to kind of maintain and build trust in areas that it's been lost?
Yeah, you know what, this is I'm not going to give it, but this is a longer dissertation that needs to occur on this issue of trust, particularly when it comes to government institutions. I think we saw there's nothing like chaos and controversy to show true character of an individual or an institution. And I think that, we all were exposed at some point or another, no matter what level, federal, state, or local governments. But I believe that what you saw, particularly on the state and local governments, for the most part, that governors and mayors showed up and demonstrated leadership for their people. On the federal level, I think many of us are bewildered and disappointed in what we saw and what we experienced. Partisanship does have its limits. And I think that when there are we are facing major challenges as a society, the last thing we want to hear about is red, blue, Republican, Democrat, independent. We want to know what's in the best interest of the American people right now. And unfortunately, federal government ran too far, too long with that partisan politics, and people got turned off. And so a lot of pressure and a lot of focus was put on the local and state level. And to some extent on the state level, they continue to play partisan politics. And it affected, I think, the trust at even the state level. I got to tell you, I might be partisan and a bit biased, but I saw mayors step up and do things that were completely out of our box. At times, buck the state system, buck state rules, and say, this is not in the best interest of our people. I saw it in Atlanta, Georgia. I saw it in other cities. And it was tough because some of us were threatened with being arrested or fined heavily, sanctioned by the state. But in the best interest of the city are our people. When you're in that place At the end of the day, it's not about me. It's what's in the best interest of folks that I represent. You got to make those tough calls. So when you talk about rebuilding the trust, I believe that when you have missteps, and in my career, I've had them as well, is that you put your head down, you work hard, and you do what's in the best interest of the job that you've been called to do. And I just believe that's how people recognize that more than anything else. Don't overact, don't overreact, overcorrect. Put your head down, go to work hard, and show the ethics of hard work and labor as the people elected you to do. And hopefully we'll see that on all levels of government in the very soon strategy.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate that. I actually think that's a great way to wrap up a little bit of your time this morning. Thank you very much for your leadership. Thank you for joining us today. It's been a great pleasure talking with you.
Real pleasure, Christian. To all of you, enjoy your day, and let's run to that light at the end of the tunnel. Take care.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Mayor. All righty. Hi, Deborah. Hi, Ed. Let's bring you back into this conversation again. And as our guests probably realize, we had all three of them for the full 45 minutes last week, but we had to reschedule. It was not appropriate for us to be bringing you this episode last week when everything that was going on in our own backyard here in Boulder in our community. So unfortunately, we don't have the mayor for the full time today, but we do have two wonderful guests who will have a lot to share. So the next 30 minutes are going to fly by. Deborah, I want to start with you as well. And then Ed, you can follow up behind Deborah. I'd love both of you to kind of just maybe be in the moment. Right? You can either reflect a little bit on something the mayor said or bring your own lens to the conversation about how we are currently doing in our business and culture here in the state of Colorado, i.e. through the work that you do in your various institutions and or reporting work. What's on your mind this morning? How are we doing? Deborah, go.
Sure. What's on my mind this morning is given and the mayor's message is so hopeful, and I'll talk about that. But what's on my mind this morning was such a devastating year for all the cultural organizations and the creative workforce. So that's artists and individual musicians, independent venues. It's been such a devastating year. What's on my mind, it keeps me up, is how many organizations we could lose in a slow recovery. We've been really lucky that we're only aware of one of the SCFD organizations that was part of another organization that has closed. So it's remarkable that in this year, we haven't seen permanent closures of organizations. But with the slow recovery, and the mayor is so right, we're on a path, but I see it as kind of a windy path. There's such optimism, but there's also concern right now. So we've got to keep thinking about how the organizations can get there, and so much of it predicated on health orders. I'm concerned about performing arts because that will be the last discipline that will be able to completely recover, and the gig economy workers, because they've got a double hit because they're both bartenders and waitresses and actors and musicians and artists. So they've been hit doubly in terms of a lack of employment. There's so many more questions we have than answers, but the other piece is really funding, and we can talk more about that as we go through this conversation. But I'm a cup half full gal, so I'm always thinking about the optimism, but we've got a lot of work to do this year.
Right. Ed, what's your thoughts?
Well, I think we're still, or at least from my perspective, I'm still coming out of this year of what have we lost and trying to reorient to where do we go. Just for those who don't know me, I cover industries including tourism, restaurants, hotels, breweries, distilleries, some of the worst hit industries. And so I've been buried for the past year in this, how bad has it gotten? The number that I keep seeing, 375,000 jobs were lost in Colorado in March and April of last year. And we've done a noble job of recovering, but there were still 160,000 jobs that haven't been recovered from that period. We're going to open up more. We're going to see many of our institutions be able to welcome more guests now. We're going to see people going back out to events, to restaurants, to places like that. But the question is, how much have we changed going forward? Where I start from is the idea that those 160,000 jobs we're still looking to get back, not all of them are coming back. I'd love to tell you that the 94,000 restaurant workers that lost their jobs over the course of 2020 will go back to the industry. They won't. We've changed our habits. We, as a society, I think is, for lack of a better word, have changed in a couple of ways. And we've adapted to being more on our own and less together, whether that be ordering meals in, watching our movies at home. And I think there are still questions about how much we go back to where we were and how quickly we do. But I think one of the bigger, more important questions is, and the mayor touched on this idea of how efficient we can be working from home, which is great. But that's going to change our cities in a fundamental way for decades to come. If we don't go back to filling the downtown office buildings, like the one I'm now sitting in, literally alone in my office, that's going to affect the restaurants, the retail, even the cultural centers that have made downtowns a place of gathering. At that point, where do those jobs go? How do we retrain the people who may not get jobs back in retail, in restaurants, in hotels, in other industries where you previously had to be present, but don't have to be so much because now people are going to learn to take things in from home. And beyond that, the bigger picture of how does that affect culture? I'm more of an expert on how business works, how our economy works. But I mean, the question is, if we separate ourselves more so than we did before, how do we get back together? How do we have those conversations, those face-to-face interactions that were really what brought us together and that frayed our society when we weren't together over the past year? So that was covering a lot of ground, but I guess I'm still thinking through, now that we are through the worst of it, hopefully we are through the worst of it. How do we get back to where we're going, and what parts of it never come back, and that we evolve, not just leave behind?
You know, I agree with you, Ed, on so many things, but especially with how do we revitalize our downtowns again? And whether it's downtown Arvada or Boulder or Denver, it's going to be businesses coming back, but it is that ripple effect for restaurants, for our cultural organizations, and people being together. You know, so much of what culture is about, clearly performing arts, is sharing an arm rest. And people, there's an interaction and energy in a theater or in a concert hall, or that you don't get watching a virtual performance. Now, all that said, some of the changes we've seen, I think, are going to be in hybrid and virtual performances and classes. But I'm like you, I have a lot more questions, and I know all the culturals do, but they're working on it.
So there is this hybrid, Ed, and I want you to, this is going to toss it back to you, right, of the idea of this hybrid workforce. You touched a little bit on that. Deborah was talking about this hybrid approach too. How does that play into, retail and some of these businesses of filling offices, like you mentioned? If there's a hybrid approach, does that meet some of that demand, or is that still just going to be, Mayor Hancock was talking about, I can't remember how he said it, but in essence, they're kind of like these pods, right, in the shared workspaces. What are you seeing in that realm?
Well, I think what we're going to see, and you're right, there is going to be hybrid, and I think a lot of employers are going to look now at letting employees work a day or two from home, or at least have a more flexible schedule. And again, that's great, but it shifts our economic focus and our activity focus. I mean, just imagine, and these are numbers the Downtown Denver Partnership put out that were stunning to me, that before the pandemic, we averaged 250,000 people a day in downtown Denver. In November, there were 50,000 people a day in downtown Denver. We can't support a lively downtown existence with that kind of drop off, quite frankly. Now, there have been changes. Covering the restaurant industry, I'll tell you, it's been interesting to hear from some of the Colorado-based chains, places like Noodles, or even a smaller chain like Michi, that say, they've literally shut downtown locations because there's not a business model that they see going forward in what are still high rent districts with very low foot traffic. And yet they're having record years in many of their suburban locations. And, we are now shifting to consuming food, consuming retail, consuming culture in the places that are closer to home. which is going to have effects on transportation and other areas too. But again, I don't think we can stress enough, if we don't get back to some semblance of gatherings or bringing people together in a downtown area, that's a long-term economic ramification that we can't just shift back to the suburbs or the small towns or other places where people will gather.
When you talk about gathering, I of course go to performances, and there have been studies done, national studies relevant to performing arts, that 83% say they're watching live stream performances, but only 14% say it's frequent and they want to go back. 53% want to go back to in person. And this is in January. So again, it just reinforces how, again, unanswered questions of where we are now and where we're going to be in the fall and a year from now on people's behavior. But I agree with you in terms of getting people back and out.
And let me go back, because I know I'm often accused by some of my readers of being too negative on this, but there have been some wonderful things that we've seen with this hybrid change, and I think even of something like the Denver Film Festival, which brought in people from areas of the state that never came to it because it went fully online this year. And so you're going to see organizations adapt to that, and we're going to see major events, major conventions, major festivals will probably forever forward have some sort of an online component that's going to be wonderful, because it's going to bring in people who can't just get in their cars or get on trains and get to downtowns where these things typically happen and be a part of it. But there are bigger picture ramifications, but I think there are some really good things coming out of hybrid life, if you may want to term it that way as well.
Well, it's about access. It's about giving the opportunity of residents or around the state or around the country, the world, like you said, for the film festival or others, that for the first time can have access to events that maybe they didn't before. So that's a plus. Mm-hmm. It's a big plus.
And Deborah, can I ask you any good examples of what you've seen from some of the cultural and institutions that you work with that you could provide as really good examples, right, of where
Sure.
they've adapted?
On the virtual programming, I think one thing is they, culturals are nimble and they're creative and they think outside the box all the time. So when things hit, there were 3 areas organizations went to. Many of our small organizations just went into hibernation. A bunch of the mid-size and the larger ones started immediately figuring out how to do online virtual programming. And so you've seen everything from, one of my favorite is taking a ukulele class at Swallow Hill, or a virtual tour of BMOCA, or a free dance class at Wonderbound, especially for kids that were at home, for parents that needs it for them to burn off a little steam and a creative outlet. So those are just a few examples of the way we've seen virtual programming be successful. The hard part is in monetizing it. And there's been so much. We did a survey last September, and 75% of the organizations said that they were trying it, but they were not successful at monetizing it. So we'll see how that evolves. Again, because it's also about engagement and accessibility, but also in reality, can the organizations, and some can and some can't, I think in the future, make this work from a financial perspective. But they're trying all kinds of things. Other organizations were really reaching out to the community, like Cherry Arts. There was no arts festival last summer. And so they have all sorts of kits and supplies that were going unused that they gave to local schools to use. So, again, it's about partnership and collaboration with the culturals.
And Ed, you're going to have to fact check me on this, and sorry to my audience for not doing my due diligence before asking this, because I heard this from someone, but I heard that there was the largest number of new business applications in potentially Colorado last year in 2020, which of course is probably, in my armchair quarterback assessment, a combination of both, this ongoing population growth that Colorado sees, as well as I think potentially probably, both businesses being struggling and going under and people coming up with new ideas as, the being creative, right, and adapting to the situation. So don't hold me to that, but where are we seeing with businesses? Are they being more creative? Are they adapting? Are they finding those opportunities? Right. That is the beauty about business and capitalism, is they look for those opportunities and then they build up from that. What have you heard in that regards as far as new opportunities for new ways of doing business or new businesses?
Yeah, and I will semi fact check you on that. I'm not sure about the highest number ever of new businesses, but I know that in the heart of the recession last year, we saw an increase in the rate of filings for new business entities. Now, this is actually not unusual. This is something we even saw back during the Great Recession, that when people are laid off their jobs, they're going to turn around and they're going to try something new. And so a lot of people who had been working for years for a company, particularly in an industry like hospitality or healthcare that saw a significant number of layoffs, went out and decided, okay, I'm going to try doing this on my own. I can think of one particular business that I've covered called Breakaway Meetings, where it was two former hotel sector event planners that decided, well, we lost our jobs. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to supply food and beverages for Zoom meetings so people can feel like they were actually at the regular meeting and do that. But the question is, I mean, how sustainable are things like that? People have been incredibly adaptive and trying to come up with new ways. And for the most part, I think it's safe to use the phrase, a lot of people have gotten through the last year. They have made it through between federal help, stimulus spending, these good new ideas, restaurants, delivering drinks with their food, cultural organizations going online. People have found a way to reach out. But you can't paper over the fact that revenues are down still. And without revenues, you can't run a business. And so there's got to be some way that companies are going to have to merge that idea of, okay, how do I reach out more to people? And to answer that demand for, which we were already doing before the pandemic, more service where I am, where I want it, rather than, hey, here's what time I'll show up to the show and see it. And that's still the unknown. I mean, how much will people continue to order out versus order in? And I'll tell you this, even during the summertime, restaurants were making 75% of their revenues from people dining in, according to one of the data dumps that I saw. That means even when they were operating at 50% max, they were still getting most of their money from people coming in. People don't naturally just shift their habits and say, okay, everything that I spent before in a store, at a restaurant, at a cultural event, I'm now going to spend that same amount at home. They did a little bit, but not as much. So there's got to be some merging of these two lifestyles going forward in terms of business innovation. And I'm gonna, if you don't mind, there's one other thing I really wanted to bring up here, because I think this is an important thing to remember, why we talk so much about the need to bring people back downtown and bring people back into some of these jobs. A number that I've got up on my screen that CU Lead School Business provided to me that I think is shocking is the unemployment by wage group. And what it shows is that never did the unemployment for high income earners, those above 75,000, dip below about 4% drop during this last recession. For the middle income earners, those between 50,000 and 75,000, it dipped to about a 7.5% drop in the worst of things in April, and it's now back around 5%. Those numbers are still down. The state's still at about a 6.2% unemployment rate, so they're doing just a little bit better. For low income earners, those who make 50,000 a year or less, there was a 30% drop in employment in April. And even now, they are still about 11% less employed than they were this time a year ago. These are the jobs we've got to figure out how to get back and how to get people. That's why it's important to get people milling around. You can't take a retail store clerk and tell them to work from home And if you can't do that, how do we talk about retraining people? I mean, maybe moving away from some of these service jobs that were so in person before the pandemic that may not be as in person going forward. What can we do to help people find the new skills that we need in more of a spaced out world to be able to get back to earning?
Deborah, I think I want you to chime into this too, because we are talking about these disproportionate impacts, right? And this widening gap. The socioeconomic that Ed pointed to, we're also seeing gender-based gaps growing. There's racial gaps. There's very much disproportionate impacts of those who've lost jobs, those who've been impacted by the COVID-19 themselves. We've talked about that. Economic opportunity is often very local. It's very local in our communities and what we're doing in our institutions and our businesses and our cultural scenes, et cetera. So, what can we all be doing? What are you seeing to help focus in on where there has been disproportionate impacts? Both of you, please chime into this. But Deborah, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Well, we saw in our survey last fall that of the 300 plus organizations, we had a great response rate, and we saw that about a third of the jobs had been furloughed or laid off. That was major. Now, we haven't done a survey since. We'll be doing another one coming up, but there's anecdotally, there's an uptick on our job board and others of hiring. I looked yesterday, and it's not a lot, but there were over 50 jobs in the arts sector, from small, from the zoo to the museum to lots of organizations. So that's a positive sign, thinking about recovery for summer. What worries me, again, is it's back to the gig economy, is that we have so many lower paid wage earners in the creative sector that are also waiters and bartenders, that we got to figure out making sure that those people can get back to work. And then just the gender gap. We've seen so many women that have gone home, that are taking care of families, and whether it's a local, national study, the time it's going to take for them to get back into the workforce may take a significant amount of time. So, that's a concern. There's also a concern, and we haven't seen much, which is great, of people leaving the creative sector. They've lost their job. They're just going to say, I can't do this anymore, I'm getting out. And we've seen a few examples of people leaving the state, doing retraining in real estate and other industries, but that has not been significant, which I'm really happy about. And again, one thing that's really helped the organizations was PPP and the funding from the community. I've got to say that funders really stepped up for relief funding. And one really silver lining in all this is that SCFD, and I think this is a testament to our metro economy versus, say, other cities, communities of like size, we, thanks to the residents, brought in $64 million and distributed over $63 million, got that out to all 300 organizations. So it's about the health of this economy. As dire as it was, we still were able to put $63 million into somewhat, to some extent, stabilizing some of these organizations. So it's a long way of saying you've got a long ways to go, and we need to get the jobs back, and we need to get things open.
Ed, any thoughts more you want to add on about some of these disproportionate impacts we've seen? And Deborah brought up some of the stimulus funding and support that we've seen coming out of government. How is that playing into what you're seeing as well?
I think the stimulus funding, first of all, the stimulus funding is fascinating, because if you look at even last April, while unemployment went through the floor, personal income actually went up because we had so much stimulus. But what we've seen is a very interesting breakdown. And I apologize, I don't remember the exact number right now, but I think it was somewhere around 46,000 a year. If you made more than that, you spent your stimulus check. If you made less than that, you saved your stimulus check. And the idea of the stimulus is clearly get money into people's hands so they can spend it right now to help those people out. I mean, I think there needs to be more of an emphasis that, what the government is giving should be spent right now. That's the thing that folks are going to need to get through. And the truth is, the next 6 months are going to be very important, even as restaurants and cultural institutions and others reopen. If people are reluctant to go out and spend, whether that be because of coronavirus fears, economic downturns, or just changes in habit, we're going to see a lot more businesses closing. That PPP goes away. Some of these loan programs are going away. And so the idea of urging people to spend now is something that I think kind of runs counter to many previous exhortations, especially to lower income folks, saying, please save your money, have that rainy day cushion. Now, I think the government needs to get out and say, look, if we're giving you money, go out and spend it, because that's what's going to be key to making sure these businesses that have been hanging on, hoping for a huge summer. And if they don't get that huge summer, I think by the fall, we could see another mass round of closings if we don't see a huge economic boom.
And Ed, I think you meant to say people over 46 saved, and then people under 46, when they got their stimulus, 46,000.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, I did. Thank you for catching that, Kristen.
Yeah.
I think summer's key to seeing success for all sorts of industries, whether it's for outdoor festivals or performances, but it's also just, restaurants, shopping, retail, getting out. And I agree with you, Ed, we're going to really have to watch and see what happens by the fall. I think, I'm always encouraging culturals to not just think of stimulus money, but to think of loan programs, because it's a great way to build credit, which normally nonprofits are always thinking about just grants that don't need to be paid back, but it's a good way to just build a credit. So that's just a small piece in thinking about the economic health of a nonprofit.
So I want you both to give our audience something that, because you're both paying really close attention to this, we're talking about maybe what the summer looks like. Give us a really good metric. This can be qualitative or quantitative, that you have your eyes on. That is, for example, you'll be really excited when X happens, or if I see Y, I'm going to get really worried. What's something from your perspective that you are really closely following and watching to think about this recovery and what's going to happen in the summer? Ed, you want to go?
I'll chime in here with an odd one. I was about to say tax revenues, but I don't think that's a good one, because tax revenues doesn't tell us whether or not we are leaving our home to purchase things. And I think, as we've mentioned, we need to leave our home to purchase things. I think those studies that are done that show personal movement are going to be key. And if you remember, back in March and April of last year during the shutdown orders, where we saw 70% less personal movement from people tracking cell phones to see where they're out and about. People need to get out and about this summer. People need to be able to return to near pre-pandemic levels of travel, whether that be to other parts of the state or even just within our communities. I think if we don't see that, I think that will show a hesitancy to return to a pre-pandemic normal, and in that case, a need to accelerate our thinking about what a more dispersed society is going to mean economically for jobs and for, I like to think of small businesses not as jobs, but as people's dreams. So if we don't see people moving about, we're going to need to do some hard looking and say, how do we move forward in the future?
Yeah, I totally agree. But for me, it's all predicated on public health orders and people and not opening too soon, and mask orders, because it all trickles down from there in terms of what sectors are going to be able to do in terms of opening up and then rebuilding the trust and the consumer confidence. So that's kind of the big one always looming out there for me.
Yeah, trust, consumer confidence. We talked about that a little bit with the mayor. I want to bring in this question, which gets back to this behavior thing, this movement of people. Ed, where do we track that? Is there a good place? I'm thinking, there's attendance at these cultural institutions where we work, right? That's potentially one idea of tracking people's movement and behavior. But what else do you see as a good data for people who are interested in following that?
That's not an easily accessible point of data. Those are usually studies that are done by companies that pass them along to governments or to other companies to understand how people are moving about. I think it'll be interesting to watch some transportation factors. Roads, for example, are back to about 90% of their pre-pandemic levels. Transit is still at not at 60, it's a 60% decline. So it's a 40% of its pre-pandemic levels, at least for RTD. I think once people feel the confidence to get back onto shared vehicles and into transit, that will also be a sign that we're going back there. And if that doesn't happen, we also need to reimagine our transportation system as well as our economic society if people decide, I'm not going back to the days of sharing vehicles and moving about in groups.
And there may be a way of doing heat mapping on that. I don't know. That's something to look into.
Well, we are coming up on our time, but I want you both maybe to close with a reflection. We spoke a little bit, and as the mayor said, we can have a whole dissertation talking about trust. Deborah, you just recently brought up, again, consumer confidence. How is it faring? How has been faring in this pandemic? And what are some really thoughtful ideas and strategies for businesses, for institutions, for government, forever that you have to ensure the trust of their consumers or their participants or their guests as they want to come back to operating, in a post-pandemic world? What are some of your thoughts there?
I can start. For me, it does go back to hope, trust, and the ability for creative people, creatives, organizations, artists, painters, musicians, to see the world with a different lens, to deal with issues in the death of George Floyd or the environment or the pandemic, to be able to see the world differently and to share that with the public. I know it sounds sort of basic, but that's what creative sector does. And it is about hope and trust and thinking of the future.
I'd say for businesses, it's follow the lead of your customers. And I think too often we get into this, where do we move forward, this, debate about capacity or to mask or not to mask. I think over the next couple months, we're going to see how comfortable people are. I mean, not just in following regulations. And I think you always default to the safest possible atmosphere if you're a business. If your employees don't feel comfortable coming back, find a way to have them scattered. If your customers want you to be masked and limited, go with that. But also follow what people are doing and see what they're looking for to trust you. I mean, maybe some of these cleaning procedures that we've seen in businesses shouldn't go away. That's not a pandemic time thing. Maybe we should be a little safer society and just see where people, where the general public feels like it wants to go from here. And I think that will help us not just trust in the institutions, but start to trust in each other a little bit more too.
Thank you both. Because I will add, I think that's a really great note, Ed, to end on, as this pandemic is not over, right? We are still living in it, but there will be future viruses. And so we have opportunities, to learn from what we're currently experiencing, to try to maybe manage this a little bit better in the future too. So this was a wonderful conversation. We could have spent so much more time. Thank you both so much for joining me today. It was an absolute pleasure getting to speak with you. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Great. It's been great. Thank you all to our audience for joining us today. And of course, thanks to the mayor for joining us a little bit earlier. If you missed me say this right at the beginning, this was episode 29 for our series. Next week, April 7th, is episode 30. And I will say it is our final episode in this long journey that we've been taking you on to understand the COVID-19 pandemic through a lot of different perspectives. It will be goodbye, but not farewell, or however that saying goes. Forgive me, I don't know it. And so while next week will be our final episode, we will promise to bring you back some bonus episodes, is what we'll call them, as major developments unfold, as major scientific advances happen, or information that we think you'll want to need. We'll absolutely come back, but we are going to wrap up with our official cadence next Wednesday. So I hope you all will join us. We've got an amazing lineup of guests and speakers, spending time reflecting on their own personal journey and impact through this past pandemic year. So next Wednesday, April 7th at 8:30 a.m. Mountain Time. It may go for a full hour next week because we have so many people joining us. Thank you all for being a wonderful audience, for your great questions in the chat and your enthusiasm and your comments. A huge thank you to our partners at the Colorado School of Public Health, my colleagues at the Institute and the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. I hope you all stay well, healthy, and find some joy today in your life. Thank you very much. Take care.